to America at its best. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I'll be your host for today's show. I'm so glad you're able to join us for our first show of the year to see all of the good things that your partnership with State Policy Network is making possible. And you know what? It's only February, but there's been some good news already. You guys have already seen the news. The Supreme Court has made one really good decision so far. They struck down the Biden administration's mandate that would have said businesses had to force their employees to either get a vaccine or take a COVID test in order to keep their jobs. Now, while this was going on, this network recognized and understood that this crazy idea out of the Biden administration wasn't about being pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. This was about an administration that was just going way too far with the power grab. And you'll be pleased to know that many groups within this network stepped up quickly and efficiently to fight it. Lawsuits went up through the lower courts from Texas Public Policy Foundation, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Mississippi Center for Public Policy, Liberty Justice Center, the Buckeye Institute, the Pelican Institute, and many more organizations who rallied together to make a difference here, along with many more organizations across the country. And they made a difference for more than 84 million people. It's awesome, especially at a time right now when the federal government is just trying to crush us every time we turn around. I'm so pleased to have two guests on our show today who are part of this major victory. Today, we'll be joined by my friend Daniel Palmer, who many of you might remember from his days on the leadership team at State Policy Network, and he's now the CEO of the Pelican Institute in Louisiana. And after we hear from Daniel, we're going to bring on one of the most brilliant legal minds in the country, Robert Alt, who's also the CEO of the Buckeye Institute in Ohio. So we've got some great stories to hear from them about how their case has made a difference in the Supreme Court's decision. So let's bring Daniel on and let's hear Daniel's story. You with us, Daniel? Daniel, I wasn't sure if you had maybe disappeared getting ready for Mardi Gras. I know it's not too far away.
As you can see, we're ready. The kids are ready. Everybody's ready. Happy Mardi Gras, everybody.
Daniel, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Now, Daniel, during this time, I heard a lot about Brandon Trosclair. He was all over the news. How did you guys find him? And tell our viewers what his story is in case they missed it.
Great. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having us on. Brandon Trosclair, who was the plaintiff in we represented Brandon in his challenge to OSHA's vaccine mandate. And Brandon, I first met Brandon back in 2019 when he was running for a state representative seat, which he narrowly lost. And then immediately in 2020, Brandon joined the class of the Pelican Leadership Academy, our effort to build a bench of free market oriented leaders who can run for office, work for policymakers, drive policy action. And it was really through that intensive year-long program that we got to know Brandon really well. And as we were working and looking for people who might be willing to challenge this vaccine mandate, Brandon took the courageous step to say, I'll do it. And boy, it was a whirlwind after that.
Wow. Now, I want to take a quick pause just for those of you who have been a part of this network for a long time. And as I mentioned, Daniel's been around for decades and decades and decades. Well, just about 2 decades, I guess. You're not that old. This Leadership Academy that Daniel mentions was started. There are a lot of leadership academies popping up across the network. Some because civics education is not being taught in the classroom, so there's some of that that's going on in these academies. But we realized a long time ago it's not sometimes just a think tank that can get the job done in a state. That's why you've seen these litigation centers pop up, like the one that Pelican's a part of in Buckeye. You've seen grassroots organizations, investigative journalism, and now these leadership academies. And it's so cool that Brandon went through the Leadership Academy and he was in some ways ready to rock and roll and be ready to speak and be a part of a Supreme Court case because he'd gone through it and it all's kind of tying together. So that's a really neat just distinction to see it all work, especially for those of you who've been investing in the network for a long time. And
Yeah, part of the curriculum is media training and background in a free society, and really that both sort of philosophical, ideological policy, but also the real practical tools that Brandon certainly put to good use during the process of his case.
And so here's Brandon, who owns grocery stores. And how is he feeling about these vaccine mandates?
So, Brandon looked at, he has a small chain of family grocery stores that started in his family. He owns and runs it now. We have about 400, somewhere between 400 and 500 employees. And, if you know anything about the grocery business right now, it's hard to find workers. And, a lot of his team has been with them a long time. Like I said, it's a small family owned community chain of grocery stores. And as he looked out and started hearing more about this proposed mandate, he said, gosh, this is going to have a huge impact on my team. This is going to have a huge impact on us. We're going to have a harder time finding workers, and the workers we have are going to be punished or put through the ringer. Let me be clear, this was not and I know everybody on this call agrees, not an anti-vax or pro-vax. This is about government overreach. And, his employees were very nervous about what this would mean for them. As he puts it, they showed up every day during the pandemic and stocked those shelves and made sure we had our Wheaties and chicken and everything else. And now all of a sudden they're going to be asked to do this. And, these guys and women really worked hard during the pandemic, and here's where they sat.
So Daniel, I was really struck through all this. Every day I was getting an email from a different organization or person claiming to be the first or to be winning on the Supreme Court case. And I was glad to see so many people were involved. So what was different about Brandon's case and your hand in this? All these people are claiming to win. Can you be clear about Pelican's lane?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just acknowledge, this is one of those situations where the network effect is very, very real. Having everyone come together to advance this cause. So many groups told Brandon's story, in addition maybe to their own lawsuit, and attacking this from a variety of different ways. Let me also note SPN's role in this, very important. Convened a webinar to help those of us in the network better understand what was coming down the pike. Connected, our suit was in partnership with the Liberty Justice Center out of Chicago, and SPN did a partnership with LJC to put out a call for plaintiffs, and so and some discussion about this certainly at the annual meeting. But so really for those of you who are watching and investing in SPN, really critical role in making sure this happened. I don't know that the same would be said if SPN and the network weren't playing an important role in this. But as to Pelican's role, Brandon was the first challenge of this in the Fifth Circuit, which of course we all know is one of the most free market oriented, constitutionalist focused circuits in the country. Brandon's challenge was first, and the first to ask for a stay of the vaccine mandate. And with almost breakneck speed, the Fifth Circuit responded immediately. Brandon's case was the case of record for issuing the stay, the emergency stay, which of course then, as Robert will talk about in the Sixth Circuit, the conflict where they overturned that stay. So when the Supreme Court finally ruled in a case led and argued by NFIB, another great partner in this effort, it was reinstating the Fifth Circuit stay that was granted to Brandon's suit. So really an important role, the first out of the gate, the first stay, and it really helped to make sure all of the other work, really good work being done across the network could go across the finish line.
By stay, you mean it meant, hey, you got to stop this for now.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you for stopping me. I can't tell you how many times I stopped. I'm not an attorney, although I'm married to one, to say, can you explain this to me like I'm a young child? But yes, a stay means they had to stop progress, stop implementation, stop enforcement of the proposed rule.
Wow, that's amazing. Here's the other thing about Pelican. I thought you guys did really well. You mentioned the media training that Brandon went through as part of your leadership academy. I was so impressed with how often you guys were in the news with this. At the end of the day, would you say that all of the media coverage you guys got played a role in the final decision here?
Oh, I'd say no question. And I'll tell you, this was one of the craziest and most exciting weeks of my professional career, to be sure. I think all told, between all of the coverage of the case with Pelican and the Liberty Justice Center, was somewhere north of 12 or 1300 media mentions, including—
What outlets did you guys appear in? Yeah, let us.
Yeah, including the USA Today and Good Morning America and Fox News and the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and the list, goes on and on. It was wild. I think everybody on our team did media that week, and we even had some international groups come in and were filming and talking about it. Obviously, this is an issue that resonates across the world. And look, this was important because, in my view, what the legacy media wanted this story to be was some political fight, right? That this was going to be Republican governors and attorneys general taking on a Democrat president. And of course, the political intrigue and the horse race and everything else is perfectly interesting. What we all know is that this was a rule and an issue that affected real people, and that was genuine and outrageous government overreach. And so being able for Brandon to tell his story and for that to be the lead narrative, and really so many across the network rallied around that, and others had really interesting and compelling plaintiffs and stories to tell as well. But it helped us to change the narrative so that the American people understood better that this wasn't some political, schoolyard fight. This was really about real people's lives and jobs. And as you said, over 80 million Americans who would have been affected by this. So I would say, being able to tell that story, getting our word out quickly in the media and telling that story as often as we could, and putting Brandon out in front, played a really important role in that.
All right, Daniel, last question, then I'm going to bring you back up after we talk with Robert Alt for questions from the audience. So if you guys have a question for Daniel or for Robert, please put it in the Q&A box at the chat. We'll bring him back up at the end. But Daniel, just real quickly, like I said, you've been in this fight for decades. You are older than you look. I remember working with you in the Obama years. I remember this network being mostly think tanks, some more effective than others. We are at a place now where we thought Obama was the worst it could be. This is much, much worse. Does this give you a sense of hope in terms of what we are able to accomplish? How does this change your perception, not just this, but other victories you've seen more recently from this network, in terms of how much of a force we can actually be? How are you feeling about that and what's actually possible in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I'm incredibly energized, and I've always been an optimist, and yet, in those early days that you and I can remember, we were all too often satisfied with stopping a bad thing from happening on a small scale, or producing really good research, coming up with a really good idea, all of which are really important. What we're seeing now, thanks to SPN driving innovation and a new way of approaching, you mentioned sort of building infrastructure in the States. What that means now, and this network coming together, and the talent that we're seeing, just incredible talent across this network, we can actually move the ball in a much more significant way and see everyone come together, not only to create big wins in our states, but to drive those up to a national impact. And it's incredibly energizing to me, to our team, and when we can see wins like this, it really gives me hope that we have evolved and grown so much, and the influence has grown so much, and effectiveness. We can do big things, and we've just got to keep our foot on the gas pedal.
Well, thank you, Daniel. We'll bring you back up in just a few minutes. Let's turn it over to Robert Alt, CEO of the Buckeye Institute, another big winner in this Supreme Court case. Hey, Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Robert, now you and I were talking, I think it was in November, and you blew me away because it was as if you were playing a game of chess inside of your head, and you already had this whole thing worked out and you knew exactly what the outcome was going to be. But for those who were not with us that night at dinner, when you were explaining all of this to me and telling me what a stay was and explaining all of these intricacies, can you tell everybody about your case and what made it critical to the mandate's rise to the Supreme Court, and the intricacies of what made your case different from all the other ones who were claiming victory here?
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for giving me this opportunity. mean, I think the difference that Buckeye had in terms of how we brought our case really boils down to three unique elements: clients, lawyers, and strategy. Clients, like Daniel suggested, obviously these are the real heroes in the case. And ours, we had amazing clients that vividly demonstrated the real world problems with this unfair rule. We're able to tell both the human story, but also able to demonstrate the financial harm that would occur in dollars and cents to their business and to the economy as a whole. Then the second element we had were an extraordinary legal team. We had Buckeye's internal team, which has extensive federal litigation experience. But because again, we didn't want to leave anything to chance, we supplemented this with outside co-counsel, and really were able to select attorneys who were going to fill particular roles. So we had two attorneys who had previously worked in the very office in the White House that handles these kinds of administrative rules. So they knew, where all the bodies were buried. They knew what the administration was doing before they released the rule to the public. Then we had two attorneys who clerked for the US Supreme Court, one of whom clerked for Chief Justice Roberts. And that ends up being very important. When you've got as many people filing in a case like this, and you've got as many briefs going before the Supreme Court, you need something that's going to break through the din. You need for when that brief ends up on the Chief Justice's desk, for him to pay attention to it, and having the name of that attorney who used to clerk for him on the brief. That's a key signal. And that really kind of goes into the third key area, which is strategy. You talked about the game of chess. It's really three-dimensional chess. You can't leave anything to chance. And we, more I think than just about anyone else, were targeted to two particular justices. We knew that was the key to winning the case. And anyone who doubts that, if you take a look at the decisions that came down, as you noted at the beginning of this, Rebecca, the Supreme Court issued one good opinion and it issued one bad opinion. And what was the difference between the OSHA mandate case, which we won, and the CMS, the healthcare worker mandate case, which we lost? I wasn't involved in that, but the country lost. The difference was two justices. And it was the two justices that we targeted in the OSHA mandate case. And so that really, having that strategy, keying in, making sure that every single argument made at every point that it was made was key to keep those justices on board. That ended up making all the difference.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask you about the healthcare workers. In fact, one of our viewers asked about the healthcare workers. So that was actually a separate mandate and thus a separate case.
It was. If you go back, I really think that the whole area can be explained by a tweet. We live in an era of tweeting. Ron Klain, White House Chief of Staff, retweeted that the OSHA vaccine mandate was the ultimate workaround to get to functionally individual vaccination rates. And so if you take a look, the Biden administration, they issued a series of mandates. You had the OSHA mandate, which covered about 84 million Americans. You had the healthcare worker mandate, which covers about 10 to 12 million Americans. You had the contractor mandate, which covers about 1 in 5 workers in the country. But all of this was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. This was an attempt by the Biden administration to force individual healthcare decisions on the public. And it really goes to the fact that the federal government does not have general police powers to cover healthcare decisions. If you think back to sort of all the issues that were going on during the pandemic, the shutdowns, the mask requirements, most of that was happening at a state level, and for good reason. The states traditionally have the authority with regard to health regulations. And so, this really goes again to how important the SPN network is on these questions, because we're fighting in the states. We have better knowledge of the ground game in the states. And then when the feds overstep their bounds and come and try and impose this on individuals, it's the SPN network that was there to stand up and push back against that.
So go back to some of the clients that you guys decided to work with that you felt would speak to the justices who would matter in this case. How did you guys find them, and what were their stories?
So we actually, I think, at the Buckeye Institute did this kind of in reverse, I think, as to how a lot of folks do, which is to say, we first took a look at the OSHA mandate and what we saw as the key problems in that regulation. What were, some vulnerabilities, what were issues that we at Buckeye thought needed to be emphasized in the litigation. And then we took a look and tried to identify individuals and businesses that would be able to really sort of emphasize those particular issues. And so, as we took a look, it really seemed that there were a number of things. Number one, as Daniel mentioned in his presentation, you have employers across this country that were having difficulty finding employees. They were suffering from issues with the labor shortage. So we were looking for companies that could really tell a story about that. We also noted that, this rule was written in a very weird fashion. It doesn't cover independent contractors. There were issues with regard to, it didn't really take into account, questions like natural immunity or how spaced apart individuals were in workplaces. And so if you were actually trying to craft a rule that really went to workplace safety, you would have probably taken these things into account. So we actually were able to identify a couple of companies that we were already familiar with. We're already familiar with the leadership in those companies. The first one, Phillips Manufacturing. That's a company I knew the head of that company. I'd done a tour of her facility. I knew how she cared about her employees and how she thought about her business. Phillips is a family-owned and operated company. It's based here in rural Ohio, and they manufacture welded steel pipe used in numerous consumer applications, including furnaces and car air conditioners. Mm-hmm. You probably have Phillips steel pipe, in your home, in your furnace, maybe in your car without knowing it. They've got about 104 employees. So part of that goes to, I think it really tells the story. They were just over the regulatory limit. And this was a remarkably responsible employer. She not only, was taking special care of her employees during the pandemic, she went ahead and did antibody testing for everyone in her plant and was able to demonstrate how many of her employees actually had natural immunity above and beyond those who had been vaccinated. But none of that mattered for the purposes of the mandate. And that really is key. It wasn't about actually keeping these individuals safe, even though studies have shown that the natural immunity may in fact be stronger, more durable, longer lasting, more resilient than the vaccinated immunity. Additionally, she went ahead and surveyed all of her employees. And so she was able to tell in her affidavit that almost 20% of her employees were going to quit or be fired rather than comply with the mandate. She just would not be able to operate if she faced those kinds of losses. And an additional 27 employees said that they wouldn't comply, but they would go ahead and do the weekly testing regime. Our second client was 6R Corporation, and it really tells the story with regard to supply chain, because this is a company that does specialty packaging of pharmaceuticals, over-the-counter and prescription drugs. And so, if in fact this rule went into place, they already were struggling to line up employees, they would have trouble actually being able to continue distributing the drugs that we need during the pandemic. They had a number of unfilled positions, and they had to actually turn to independent contractors to fill spaces. Yet those independent contractors wouldn't be covered by the rule. So the rule would not in fact be keeping them safe. And in both cases, both in Phillips and 6R, they were able to quantify and demonstrate, contrary to what the government had argued in the case, that this was going to be extraordinarily costly for them. Phillips, it was going to cost them over $900,000 in the first year. 6R estimated $44,000 in costs per week. These were real costs. But the bigger cost was ultimately going to be to the consumers. If in fact this went into place, if it harmed the ability of companies like Phillips and 6R to be able to manufacture, that was going to be more empty shelves when you go to the grocery store. And we'd already had enough of that during the pandemic.
Robert, the beautiful thing about everything you just said, I mean, it was all brilliant and wonderful, but you guys brought common sense to what the federal government was trying to impose on us in a million different ways. I mean, every point you just made was just common sense, common sense, common sense, shoved down their throat from some big blanket mandate that just made no sense. And we all knew it didn't make sense, but I love all of your points because it's just common sense. That's brilliant. And it worked. I love it. So here's a question that's on everyone's mind. And I got this from a couple of folks who are viewing today. And unfortunately, this stuff is just a constant fight, a constant slog. And you probably know better than anyone, what's next? Is President Biden going to let this go, or is he going to bring it back to us in a different form?
So I was very pleased after we got the stay from the Supreme Court. I mean, as you noted in the previous discussion, that is sort of a preliminary stage in the litigation. It says you cannot go ahead and enforce this federal government against companies in the United States while the legal challenge continues. But in the meantime, the Biden administration went ahead and threw in the towel on this emergency rule. They sent a filing to the court saying that they were going to withdraw the rule entirely. And so that's a huge victory. But, what they give with one hand, they take away with the other. They went ahead and said, oh, by the way, we're going to go ahead and continue to treat this as a proposed final rule. We're going to leave it hanging out there. We're going to take potentially notice and comment on it, essentially leaving out the threat that they might go ahead and come back with the rule at some later date. To which I have one simple message for the Biden administration. If you do that, the Buckeye Institute will see you in court.
Well said. Well, and also, last question before we bring Daniel back, is there anything we can do to help the healthcare workers?
That's a tough case, quite frankly. Unfortunately, the fact that the Supreme Court, again, it wasn't the end of the case, but they went ahead and said that they were not going to stay it. And they did so based upon the Supreme Court's view of whether or not they were likely to win. The challengers were likely to win in their case. That means that they, much like the mountain behind me, which is a tall mountain, that means that the challengers have a really tall mountain because they don't have those two justices. It really goes back. The initial strategy matters, making sure that you've targeted them. And it's going to be, now that the two justices are on record the way they are, I think it's going to be hard to, I will say that's a huge issue. It's a huge issue with regard to distribution of healthcare across this country. You talk to folks in rural areas, they were already seeing shortages of healthcare workers, and this is not going to help. But I'm afraid this is where strategy matters. And unfortunately, I don't know if there's going to be a way to take this one back.
Okay, fair enough. Well, it's 12:30. We usually wrap up the show around 12:30, but we have had some questions come in. So if you can stay with us for a few more minutes, please do. If you have to drop off, we are recording this, so we can follow up by sending the recording. Daniel and Robert, thanks for staying for a couple more minutes. So a couple of questions for both of you guys. How are you hearing that businesses are responding to the victories? Are they rescinding their own mandates, or are some of them keeping them? Are you guys hearing anything? Daniel, we'll start with you.
Sure. The first thing I'd say is most of the business leaders, entrepreneurs I speak with are just overjoyed by this. This was going to be a huge burden on them, on their teams, a strain on the relationship between the teams and everybody else, right? That none of them want to be in the position of getting involved in private medical decisions of their employees. As it relates to implementation, everybody takes a different approach to it. And this is the benefit of free markets, right? And freedom is for some, they are in a position where masks or vaccines or something like that matter. I've heard of some that are just trying to incentivize vaccines. They get an extra day of vacation or some sort of perk if they show the vaccine, but not mandating it. So lots of different approaches. And then of course, others are very hands-off and let things move forward. But overall, just a great sense of relief from the burden that this would have put on everybody in the process.
Anything to add, Robert?
Daniel covered it well. Just a couple of small points. One, I do feel like, to my mind, part of why I think the Biden administration tossed out that they were still considering a final rule was to continue to provide cover for some companies that actually want to blame the federal government for doing this. And I've heard this through various channels, some of the big companies in particular. They want to do a mandate, but they don't want to take the heat for a mandate. We don't want to do it, but the feds are making us do it. The feds are considering a final rule. So I think you're seeing some of that, but I'd rather focus on folks like Phillips Manufacturing, like 6R, who did not want to do this, and this is one of the things that I think was missed. I mean, the Supreme Court was a little slow, quite frankly, in issuing its opinion. We asked very quickly, literally within 2 hours of the stay being lifted in the Sixth Circuit, we had physical papers filed with the Supreme Court to go ahead and get this stay reinstated to make sure that this rule was not imposed upon our clients. The Supreme Court actually waited 3 days after the rule went into effect before it issued its ruling. And companies across the country were sweating bullets because they knew if we go ahead and say, okay, here's how we're implementing the rule, people are filing their resignation letters that day.
Yep.
And so the real story here is, companies like Phillips, companies like 6R, companies like the one that Daniel represented, that did not want to put this rule into place, they were saved from having to ever do that.
Mm-hmm. Next question I want to send to you first, Robert, because there's still a little ambiguity around this fact that there's still a lot of people claiming credit for this victory. And I think that there are a lot of people who should. I know NFIB was a main litigator. Dozens, maybe hundreds of groups even filed lawsuits. And a lot of the lawsuits in the lower courts made a difference here. Can you help explain to our viewers, who are the leaders and how did the network's cases make a difference? I think we understand specifically how yours made a difference because they were in two of the main circuits that bubbled up. If I'm saying that correctly, you can probably say it better. But can you help our viewers understand, because they're getting emails from everybody, and I think a lot of them are justified. I think there's more than one leader in this. It takes a lot in something like this, but I think you can speak to it better than I can. I'm still also having trouble understanding.
Absolutely. Well, I'll leave it to Daniel to talk about his case. I can talk more about mine, and I suppose I would say, fundamentally, if you're trying to define who a leader is, what you would look at is who's following, who's leading and who's following. And so with regard to, our litigation, what I would say is, we talked about the strategy. There were a number of steps where we weren't just first, we actually had the strategy that others were following. So I'll give just one example on that, which is, so when the cases all got consolidated in the Sixth Circuit, which is a weird procedure, literally they pull it's like the lottery. They pull a little ping pong ball out of a drum and all the cases got sent there. Buckeye, because of our knowledge of the circuit, because of our knowledge of the case, we were able to see things that others missed. And we recognized that actually we had gotten a bad 3-judge panel before, and we were able to tell this before it was announced. And what that meant is that all Daniel's good work in getting that initial stay was probably going to get blown up by this court. And ultimately that's what happened. So we went ahead and asked for the full 16 judges on the court to hear the case on a procedure called initial en banc, so that we leapfrog the panel. We just asked the full court to hear it. A lot of lawyers don't even know you can do that. And a lot more don't know when it's appropriate or how it is they should do it. So I actually chatted with a number of other, sort of leading attorneys in the cases, to tell them we were doing this. And many of them actually urged me not to do that. One prominent attorney even said, better you than me. I don't want to anger the court. I don't know if this is the right time to bring this case, this challenge in that way, asking for the full court to hear it. That same attorney a week later was filing his own motion following mine, asking the full court to hear the case. And it was because of this initial en banc review, this 16-judge, Chief Judge Sutton of the Sixth Circuit wrote probably the most scholarly opinion that had been written on this. And Chief Judge Sutton, again, happens to be a highly respected judge by those two justices that we were targeting. It went back to that chess game. It was all part of the plan to make sure that we got him on record and got that before the court. We then cited him for every proposition of law. And if you look at the Supreme Court decision, it's short. You can look at every time C.J. Sutton is listed. And that essentially what that is saying is Chief Judge Sutton responding to Buckeye's motion. Every time you see that, that really laid the foundation for what ultimately became the Supreme Court victory.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly to that, Rebecca. Obviously, Robert knows this work inside and out. One thing I'll say is, I think it's worth celebrating that there was so much swift reaction to this. Any victory is going to have all sorts of fathers and claims of success, and the truth is, everyone probably has a little bit to do with that. And again, I think it's exciting that the network is in such a place that we have such ability to quickly respond to something like this. I think from our point of view, as Robert said, the question comes down to who's leading and who's following. And we were thrilled to work very closely with, obviously, our partner at the Liberty Justice Center, but coordinating regularly with Robert and his team and the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Mississippi Center for Justice, or Justice Institute rather, and others around the country, so that we could coordinate our efforts as much as possible and make sure we could be complementary to one another rather than competitive. And I think, again, I'll give a lot of credit to SPN for fostering that culture of complementary work. We're all in this together, and at the end of the day, the outcome is what we want. Credit is far less important, but we can all learn from where each other are coming from, and from Robert's experience and expertise in this, from our attorneys' work in this. All of it comes together to lead to victory.
Well, and there were also people involved in this outside of the network, right? Just regular.
No question.
Yeah. So it was just interesting to see it all come together. And Robert, I introduced you as perhaps one of, if not the most brilliant legal minds in the country. And I don't know if that makes you blush, but I think you've made that pretty obvious while you've been here. I just loved hearing about the way you approach strategy, which gets into one of my favorite questions that someone asked is, how have the groups involved with litigation worked together or with SPN? And part of that is making sure, and I'll just go ahead and take the first shot at answering this. I mean, we have people like Robert to connect with some of these newer litigation centers. Robert and Daniel, I think, are both somewhat involved with American JurisLink, which was started and incubated by State Policy Network a few years ago. When we saw these litigation centers start to pop up, which was great, we realized there needed to be an SPN for litigators, if you will, to keep everybody connected and working together. And Daniel and Robert, I'll let you guys talk a little bit more about how you've been working together and staying connected. But anytime people can stay connected, it just helps accelerate everything we do in the network.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, Robert, if that's okay. I agreed. Our friends at American JurisLink are incredibly helpful. Our lead attorney, Sarah Harbison, on this talks, I think, weekly, if not more often than with a cohort of other litigators across the country, sharing notes, looking at where there's opportunity, where there may be challenges, an opportunity to brainstorm with one another and get good challenge. The thing I have as a non-lawyer learned most about litigation and the process of launching our litigation initiative is that all those things you mentioned, common sense, that seem like they ought to be legally challengeable, sometimes aren't. And I've also learned that the other side is very clever, often in how they write bad policies so that it helps ward off some efforts of legal challenge. So the things that we all may think seem like slam dunk legal cases very often are not. And the only way you really figure that out is by going through a process of challenge with one another. So there's constant communication. Robert, in particular, I remember you and I got on a call with our teams just a month or so ago to brainstorm about a couple of potential cases. So all of that really works together, and we're all so much stronger because of the power of the network and our ability to work together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Daniel said. I mean, first and foremost, I had, from the earliest days of this litigation, I had multiple conversations with folks across SPN as they were reaching out to individuals as they had questions, as I was just keeping them informed. Rebecca noted the conversation we had very early on, where I was sketching out some of the strategy, and having those conversations is just essential. I mean, really just sort of keeping those lines of communication open. Daniel mentioned the call we had early on in another case, but we had, numerous conversations with other SPN groups that were involved in the litigation at various stages, and through. I think it's just part of it is just making sure everyone's on the same page. They understand, because I mean, there's a lot when you're looking at a case like this, and you guys are just getting a thumbnail sketch. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces, and so making sure everyone's moving in the same direction. I mean, that's really essential, and having that high level of communication that SPN has helped to create among the groups is just absolutely a key to procuring this kind of a fabulous victory.
Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, those of you who are with us. We've gone way over on time, but this has been such a good conversation. I figured let's just let it go. I will say this, the mountain that is behind Robert, he's actually climbed that mountain. It feels like we're all, this sounds so cheesy, I know, but it does feel like we're all still climbing one together. We've got a long way to go for the next few years. Thank you. Those of you who are on today, you guys are all making it happen. And we've just got so much more to do. So we'll let you know when the next show is. Thanks again for being a part of it. And guys, this was a really big win. They cannot just throw mandates at us for whatever they want to do. So it was huge. Thank you so much for making it happen. It was awesome. So we're going to celebrate y'all for the rest of the day. Thanks again. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.